country. So absolutely honoured to have you join us today, David. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Catherine, and it's really a great pleasure and honour to be able to take part in the programme which you put together with fantastic skill, and thank you very much to Pat, wherever he is, for the great hospitality and support that the Ireland at Expo team has provided. For me, it's really a thrill to be here. I'll try to give you some idea of what the SDGs are about, how they came into existence. I will then later on look specifically at the issues around sport, disability and human rights, which are all interconnected, and I'll try to focus on them and explain how they were dealt with and why they were dealt with in that way in this document. Let me say at the outset why I'm here, I suppose, or what my particular role was. At the UN, there is a practice of asking some ambassador from the developed countries, what's called the Global North, to team up with an ambassador from the Global South to chair a large and complicated and sensitive negotiation process. The theory is that somebody from the Global North will have a better sense of the issues which are important for developed countries, and vice versa, the colleague from the South. But our role, so in my case, it was Ireland and Kenya who were asked to chair the negotiations which led to the Sustainable Development Goals and to the wider 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. We were chosen, as I say, coming from two different parts of the world, but perhaps one reason why Ireland was chosen was that we are seen as an honest broker at the UN, in the sense that we bring no particular baggage with us. We have a good reputation in relation to our development cooperation, our human rights record, our support for peacekeeping, a number of things like that. But most of all, I think we enjoy confidence in many parts of the world, including in Africa. So there are various reasons why Ireland was chosen, and Kenya, of course, is a major developing country. The role which myself and my Kenyan colleague were asked to play was that we not only convened the negotiations, but we had to actually develop a draft of the document. And the way it worked out between us, I did a lot of the drafting and my colleague did a lot of the tactical consultations with developing countries. That was the rough division of labour. So it meant that we were responsible for putting together a package which included the goals and targets themselves, a declaration which explained what the world leaders were trying to do in setting out these, in agreeing these goals. Then there were sections relating to how we would monitor progress towards implementation. Another section about the means of implementing the goals, both financial means and non-financial means. The entire package is called the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development because it was meant to cover a 15-year period from 2015 to 2030. So we use the phrases SDGs and 2030 Agenda interchangeably. But for example, the phrase leaving no one behind, that comes from the declaration. So an important point to make is that the declaration is every bit as valid as the goals and targets. They all represent the considered view of 193 governments and countries. There are 193 countries in the world. They're all represented at the UN, and this was agreed without reservation by every single country in the world. So I can't emphasize that enough. So let me explain how this whole thing started. As Catherine said, you originally had the Millennium Development Goals. There were 8 of those. They came into existence in the year 2000, but they were essentially written by a couple of UN officials. They were never negotiated, so they were drafted by a couple of people working at the UN and simply announced by the Secretary General of the UN in the year 2000, hence the name Millennium Development Goals. They were very much the richer part of the world telling the poorer part of the world what it needed to do in order to get development cooperation. So there was a kind of a top-down, slightly patronising approach underlining them, and that was really a weakness from the beginning. They were very much targeted at developing countries, they were for developing countries, and they had not been negotiated by every country in the world. They were simply, as I say, written by a couple of UN officials. So in the meantime, the view took hold that for the next set of goals, which would apply from 2015 on, that we needed to have ownership by every country in the world of this new set of goals. That was number one. Number two, we had a new concept called sustainable development, which was firmed up really in the years between 2000 and 2015. Namely, in order to tackle poverty, we have to look at the other dimensions as well. So the environmental dimension. We're now all much more familiar with climate change and what that means, but recognizing that you cannot properly tackle problems around health and education unless you also are tackling issues like the damage done by climate change, desertification, the destruction of natural habitats. All of these impact on basic poverty eradication objectives such as improving health and education systems. And then the third dimension was balanced economic growth, ensuring that countries operate economic policies which are fair and which do not purely depend on profit motives, but which recognise the need to reach out in all directions. So the combination of these three dimensions, the economic, the social and the environmental, that produces the idea of sustainable development. So there was a strong sense that the next time round we would have to have a more ambitious agenda which would cover those three dimensions. And then the last sort of distinction from the MDGs was that we would have to negotiate these. So first of all, you have a much wider agenda. Secondly, you have to have every country in the world involved in negotiating them. And the third aspect was that every country in the world would implement a single document. So this is what Catherine referred to as universality. This is this idea that it is a single text for every country, rich and poor, for the US, for Russia, for China, for Suriname, for the Maldives. In other words, every country, without exception, is going to pursue the same set of policies, and that is really quite unique in the history of the UN and indeed the history of the world. So I should say that this was the largest, most difficult, most sensitive negotiation in the UN's history. Why do I say the largest? Because in addition to having simply diplomats negotiating, you had a vast number of civil society representatives from around the world. You know, there could be people who were health experts, education experts, sports experts, you name it. Every conceivable interest group wanted to have its impact on the emerging agenda and the emerging negotiations. And therefore they were fully involved, really, not directly as negotiators, but they were almost in the room with us. So for several years before the negotiations began, you had a mobilization of civil society all around the world, spearheaded by the UN. They launched a thing called the My World Survey, which tried to elicit what the preferences were all around the world for a new agenda. So and then you had the private sector who saw, actually, in a very positive sense, opportunities from this agenda. They wanted to express their own social responsibility, their own commitment to improving the welfare of everybody on the planet. They wanted to show their commitment to sustainability. They also recognized that there would be new markets developing with the implementation of the SDGs, and that they could have access to those, but only on the basis of signing up to sustainability principles. So, if you like, there was something in it for the private sector, but from a benign and humane point of view. So those are examples of the other groups outside the room, as it were, who sent in multiple drafts of the document and discussion texts and everything else. So it meant that in addition to trying to get the agreement of the 193 countries to this new document, to this new programme, we also wanted to reflect what civil society was telling us around the world, which wasn't necessarily the same as what the governments were telling us, but we were trying to get a reasonable balance. I started my work in October of 2014. There had been an earlier phase, a kind of an informal phase involving 30 countries, which produced draft goals and targets. And I happened to be part of that. I wasn't chairing it. My Kenyan colleague had chaired that with another country, and but I was actively involved in it, but didn't have the responsibility. We came up with the 17 goals in preliminary form in that phase, plus the targets under each. So for those who aren't familiar, under each goal there will be 7 or 8 sub-goals covering subdivisions. So, for example, there's a health goal, which might just be a single sentence, like, I mean, I don't have them off by heart, but something like, we will ensure universal access to affordable health care. That, I think the health goal is something like that. And under that there would be a target on maternal health, another one maybe on children's health, and so on. So that's what we mean when we say 17 goals and 169 targets. So those are the SDGs. I should say that we're here in Dubai at the moment, where we're in the middle of a Global Goals Week. Strictly speaking, these are not called the global goals, but I think for snappy communication one can sometimes refer to them as that. But they're, strictly speaking, they were known as the Sustainable Development Goals, and because I was doing a lot of the drafting, that's what we settled on at an early stage. How do we organise the negotiations? My colleague and I would convene once a month, roughly speaking, a coming together of all 193 governments through their diplomatic representatives in New York. And we would ask them to indicate their views in relation to the different components of what would become the new agenda. It was for us, from myself and my colleague, to come up with the basic draft of the document. In UN speak, they call that the zero draft, starting from zero. For tactical reasons, we didn't actually table that until the 1st of June of 2015. In other words, only 2 months ahead of the adoption. Sometimes if you play your cards too soon, you can end up creating more problems than it's worth. We were trying to build up consensus gradually to a point where the document would not come as a major surprise, and where we would have a better chance of getting it through. And we actually needed 6 successive drafts of the document to get it finalised and adopted on the 2nd of August. So just to give you an idea of how it happened. How were the various issues dealt with? If problems were presented by individual groups of countries or individual countries, we would try to resolve them by adjusting the language a little bit. Where that didn't work, we would end up doing trade-offs between across different sets of issues. So if, for example, the Asian countries had particular concerns, we would try to do deals between them and the African countries on something else. And so it really involved a lot of the time myself and my colleague having private chats in the corridors and trying to broker solutions, as distinct from doing it all with 500 people in the room, because normally we had 500 people in the room. It was quite chaotic at times. We were fortunate in a number of respects. One was that normally at the UN you have big regional blocks of countries who have, say, one representative, and there's a lot of sparring between the country representing the Africans and another country representing the Latin Americans. On this occasion, yes, we had interventions from the different regions, but we also allowed individual countries to take the floor. The reason was that this was a huge agenda in which every country in the world would have a stake. So it was considered fair to give every country a chance to speak beyond what their regional representative was saying. That ultimately enabled us to see where the compromises might arise across the different issues. It was a bit chaotic at times when you're trying to reflect the views of 75 countries that you've just heard, but on the whole I think it did work out eventually, and that the power of the individual blocs was reduced. Another thing is that normally there are tensions between the global north and the global south on the way in which the negotiations are handled. And one such tension is that often the developing countries will put up with somebody like me or the Kenyan colleague for a while, but towards the end, when the going gets tough, they want to get rid of us and to put all the drafts up on a screen without a chairman. And the idea is then that we work our way through multiple drafts of the same document. It is a recipe for complete chaos. And my colleague and I were determined to avoid that at all costs if we could. So it meant that we were trying the whole time to project A, unity of purpose, and B, in other words, unity between us, and B, a determination to finish the negotiations efficiently and on time. So we had a deadline of the 31st of July, and we kept on emphasising this almost like a mantra, that come what may, we were going to finish these negotiations on that day. This caused some bewilderment on the part of many countries who said, what's the hurry? Because this summit, which is going to happen to formally adopt the new SDGs, would only be taking place in the middle of September. So why are you trying to wrap up everything by the 31st of July? The real reason, of course, was that we wanted to avoid brinkmanship, where somebody where people would think if the negotiations were still happening on the 21st of September and on the 22nd it was going to be adopted, then they thought they might get advantage from that and, hold us all to ransom. We wanted to avoid that at all costs. So it meant that we had to come up with lots of rather ridiculous excuses for why we couldn't go a day beyond 31st of July. In the event, we got away with that because we finished the whole thing on the 2nd of August, which was 6 weeks ahead of schedule. It was only just 2 days over our own deadline, and we got everybody on board. There were no reservations expressed, no difficulties, no outside intervention. That sometimes happens where if the two chairs are considered to be useless, they then bring in somebody else at the last moment. That didn't arise. But the thing that I'm happiest and proudest about, I have to say, was the involvement of civil society to the very end. This again may seem obvious to people, let's say, in the global north, that NGOs should be free to express their views. It is not obvious to countries with a different tradition in the global south. And what happens is that they tend to tolerate the presence of civil society representatives who are in the gallery above the room. They're in the room, but they're not actually negotiating. The presence of civil society people is tolerated, but towards the end, the developing countries will frequently say, we want them out, because they don't want to be pressurized by ideas, even perfectly good ideas, but they don't want to feel under that pressure. So somehow, using various tricks, my colleague and I managed to keep civil society at the back of the hall until the very end, and that meant they were there for the last night or two when we were staying up all night to finish the negotiations. But crucially, it meant that when we finally got the thing adopted, on a Sunday afternoon, the civil society people were with us the whole way through. Why is that important? Because it means that they also supported the agenda. They were almost there at the birth, as it were. So they felt that they had ownership of it, and they had opportunities in the middle of the night to go and talk to individual delegates privately. So it may seem like a small point, but this is meant to be a universal agenda which not only the governments are implementing, but which is also supported by civil society. And I mean by that, obviously people who are experts in particular fields, but also the private sector as well, and academia, all the stakeholders, as they're called. They were present at the birth of the agenda, and therefore they are part of the sort of the wider family taking it forward. So that was quite important. What else? Let me talk a bit about the declaration, because it's important in terms of the issues we'll be discussing here. The declaration may seem a fairly obvious thing, that, you know, in addition to the concrete goals and targets, the world leaders wanted to explain what they were about, what was the point of this agenda, which had never previously been attempted. As I say, this was the first time. So we had to draft something which would, on the one hand, give a kind of a summary account of what we were doing, but on the other hand, not go into endless detail, because otherwise it becomes unusable. So we eventually have a 12-page declaration, and we tried to emphasize a number of points in that, such as the universality, the fact that this is an agenda for every country. But if you think of it in terms of people setting out on a road, because that was the way I was thinking of it, no country is yet, or if you like, think of it as a finishing line. We're all heading towards the finishing line. Some countries are very far back, others are practically there, but no one country has actually crossed the finishing line in terms of the ambition that we've already set. I won't name individual countries, but you can think of, say, certain Scandinavian countries are highly developed, well off, have social conscience, but nevertheless none of them has actually reached the finishing line. So that's, we can honestly say that all of us are heading towards 2030, and that's where this phrase came in. As we set out on the road to 2030, we pledged, that we being all the world leaders, we pledged to leave no one behind. What was meant by that was that we wanted to ensure that the needs of the most marginalised and vulnerable communities would be addressed. And since I was drafting that, I then added a second sentence, and we will endeavour, I had to compromise on the word endeavour, but and we will endeavour to reach the furthest behind first. So we would get to the most vulnerable groups first. I meant by that, when I was drafting it, the first 3 or 4 years. Some people have contrived to suggest that I didn't necessarily say that, but that's certainly what I meant. That they would be that in time terms, we would actually, that governments would front load their resources on the needs of the poorest communities. I then had to give a few illustrations of the poorest, and in no particular order, I put in children, elderly people, persons living with disability, and migrants and refugees, and a couple of others as well. These are meant to be illustrations of what we meant when we said leave no one behind. I should emphasise that this particular concept of leaving no one behind was not controversial. No governments said that's going too far. So, you know, there were some issues in the negotiations which are very difficult, but this was not one of them. So everybody accepted the idea that we should prioritise the needs of the most vulnerable groups. The second sentence about reaching the furthest behind first, I didn't think I would get away with that. I thought that there would be some countries who would say that really is putting too much pressure on budgets and so on. But again, maybe they felt there was comfort in the phrase, we will endeavour to. So that maybe they thought they had a let out there. But one way or another, they accepted it. And so that means it's a very useful tool for advocacy ever since. In the meantime, I'm afraid the phrase itself has almost become a bit cliched. You know, you see it in every conceivable context, but it was intended to suggest that there would be that nobody would be abandoned. One reason for that was that in the MDGs, there was a sense that the needs of the poorest groups had not been properly identified, and so we were trying to counteract that. Otherwise, in the declaration, there was a lot of controversy over how you summarise the goals. Can you summarise the goals? We came up eventually with a formulation, the 5 Ps, so people, planet, prosperity, peace and partnership. Happily, they all began with P in English. They don't necessarily begin with P in other languages, but that was the only basis on which we could get agreement for summarising the entire programme, because too many countries would say, we like this rather than that. We're prepared to accept this, but not that. So nobody could really deny that it was about people. It was about planet in the sense of the environmental goals. It was about prosperity in the sense of the economic dimension. Peace was a tricky one. That's SDG 16. That's the one about achieving or pursuing peaceful and inclusive societies. Why was it controversial? Because, again, in the global north, it's taken for granted that you cannot really achieve development without peace. But in the global south, there is a legitimate fear that that could become a condition, that people would, that you know, European countries might say, we will only support developing countries if they have achieved peace. And there's almost a contradiction there. Some countries, let me take Somalia as an example, or Sudan, clearly they have an ongoing major problem with achieving peace. But we would, in Ireland, for example, we would see that as a valid objective in itself. It's a development objective to establish peace. It doesn't mean that you're saying we will only support countries who have already achieved peace. So you can see why the SDG 16 was controversial. Partnership then was the last one, and that in some ways, Catherine touched on it as well. Partnership is the only one of the 17 goals which is more answering the question how rather than what. It was felt from the beginning that this was going to be an agenda not only for governments. Even in purely financial terms, governments on their own could not mobilise the resources needed to achieve these goals by 2030. You're going to have a vast involvement of the private sector on the basis I described earlier. And indeed UN organisations, philanthropic foundations, think of the Gates Foundation, think of Rockefeller, think of, there were lots of worthy organisations with large budgets. So we knew we would have to have a coalition of interests around the world who would work with governments to achieve the goals. That's why the term partnership came in. So partnership can mean at the kind of macro level that you would have coalitions of, it might be 2 or 3 governments plus a UN agency plus Microsoft plus the Tanzanian government. I mean, a partnership can mean partners in that sense, but it can also mean at the local sense, at the very local sense, partnership of individual interests around a specific goal, target, or just issue. And indeed, well, you know, what Catherine is spearheading is very much, that's an example of a partnership where you have various interests. You have a UN agency, you have, and ideally more UN agencies, you have development banks, hopefully you have private sector involvement, you have academic involvement. I mean, the community around sport and inclusion and development is a good example of where somewhat diverse interests can come together to pursue a particular goal. So we really mean partnership at every level, and it's in some ways the most important goal, although officially I'm not supposed to say any of the SDGs is the most important. They're all equally important, which is why the beautiful symbol has a circle with 17 chinks of light, showing that they're all equally, or chinks of colour, showing that they are all of equal importance. Why 17? It's an awkward number, I agree. Think of it this way, the Millennium Development Goals were 8, there were 8 of them, and we knew, roughly speaking, that when you added in the extra 2 dimensions, that we were probably going to end up with a rough doubling. On the other hand, you couldn't have 25 or 30 goals because that would just be unwieldy. At some stage, a few countries said, could we not reduce the 17 slightly to maybe 15? The problem then was that which 2 would you drop? There would be no consensus on which 2 should go. Some people felt that the climate goal, which is number 13, could be reduced, because it could be knocked off, because at the same time the Paris Agreement negotiations were underway. and they concluded 3 months later, in fact, in December of 2015. But others said, no, you cannot imagine a development agenda which somehow doesn't have climate change as part of it. So that didn't work. So ultimately, there was no agreement on which two. Another country actually wanted to have only 10 goals, and that was also considered to be unrealistic. So we ended up staying with 17, and again, 169 targets is a little bit awkward as well, but after a while people forget about these defects. Another thing I should mention is indicators. Now, in layman's terms, an indicator would mean that you would take, for example, a particular target. Let's imagine the target is to reduce by half the number of children who die below the age of 5, to reduce by half by 2030. I'm half inventing that. An indicator would be the number of children of such deaths by the year 2023 or by the year 2027. So you'll all understand that. Those indicators were developed, but not as part of our negotiations. They were developed by statisticians within the UN system and with involvement from a number of national statistical offices, including, incidentally, the Irish one. But I had no responsibility for those. It was a very useful exercise, but it was not, strictly speaking, they were not negotiated by 193 member states. They were really developed by a smaller group of statisticians, and the idea was to produce indicators which would help governments, would give them a guide to what should be done, but if the governments wanted to go a bit further themselves and stretch themselves, they could do that by having national indicators. So, roughly speaking, that was the approach. The targets themselves, this was a tricky thing. Some of the targets are numerical, so it'll be we pledge to, or we commit to reduce by half or reduce by 75% some particular situation. It may seem hard to believe, but developing countries for a long time didn't want to go near, they didn't want to change in some cases there were no numbers. The provisional version of the targets had simply X% in it. So the developing countries were extremely nervous about revisiting the goals and targets after that preliminary phase that I mentioned. So it took a long time to get consensus, even to have the targets finalised in the way that you know them. I wanted to keep an I should keep an eye on the time. Let me move perhaps to sport and human rights and inclusion at this stage, and disability. Sport. The background there was straightforward enough. I was lobbied by lots of countries about lots of issues. In the case of having an inclusion, having a reference to sport included, Monaco approached me. Monaco, I think, would see itself as a champion of the Olympics, and in any event, Monaco asked early on for a reference of some kind to be made to sport. I spoke at a couple of side events, as they're called, relating to sport and development, and out of that, and in consultation with Monaco, I drafted the paragraph which you saw earlier on. That was not controversial. Again, nobody brought up any criticism of that, or the only issue was that at the beginning we had combined that with culture. Now, the reason, sort of culture diversity, the reason was that there was a lot of resistance to having any issues which were seen as extra, as discretionary, because then the risk was that all kinds of people in countries would come with all kinds of shoppiness. So maybe it was an excessive caution on my part, but I had a sort of single paragraph covering both sports and cultural diversity, but in the event then we divided in two. So paragraph 37, the one you saw earlier, it stands on its own. There was a good deal of support from developing countries for that paragraph. They all liked it, and so I think it meant what you were showing earlier, Catherine, the way in which there's been a build-up of international interest in the connections between sport development, that was reflected, in fact, in our negotiations, because without any effort, I suddenly found that we had a consensus in favour of that. So that was straightforward. On persons living with disability, again, there were various references in the goals and targets, or specifically in the targets, there were references to disability, usually around the need to disaggregate data on the basis of disability, among other criteria. So that was already there. My main contribution was to bring in the concept of leaving no one behind, and then to mention persons living with disability as an example of that. And again, that was accepted by everybody. Nobody challenged that. An effort was made, perfectly reasonable effort was made from within civil society to subdivide the disability reference into various forms of disability. And I was open to that, but when I had consulted on it, I was told, if you break it down into, say, intellectual disability or sensory disability, you then get into difficulty, because there could be 5 or 6 separate categories, and each will feel that it has to have its moment, its place. So it was felt overall that it was too risky to subdivide. So we left it the way it was. But the indicators work, which I outlined a moment ago, would give the basis for, I mean, there's nothing to stop somebody trying to track how intellectual disability should be addressed in terms of implementing the goals. So, in effect, that's what civil society agreed to do. The human rights framework, more generally, the human rights really underpin the entire SDGs and 2030 agenda. There is, they are cross-cutting, and we have a number of paragraphs in the Declaration which talk about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, other international human rights treaties, and and we give prominence to them. I have to say that is not obvious. There are many developing countries who would feel that human rights are overemphasized by the global north, and that it has to be kept under some degree of control. You wouldn't believe the degree to which we had to quibble with, to negotiate with them over the place, the positioning of human rights references in the text. The Global North wanted them right up front in the beginning of the relevant paragraphs. The Global South, broadly speaking, wanted them to almost disappear. So we had to reach various compromises on that. But I'm satisfied that we have a good coverage of human rights treaties and instruments within the text as a whole, and every country in the world has signed up to that without reservation. So it means that, I think as Pat was saying earlier, that this agenda is politically binding. It's morally has a moral force. It's not legally binding, but nevertheless, the reference to legally binding international human rights treaties is important in itself. It means that the world leaders are in effect giving their blessing, or they are recognising that while the agenda itself is not legally binding, it's linked into various international treaties which are legally binding. So there's a kind of an approval being given there. I'm coming to an end of my remarks, but let me just add in something else. What are these goals meant to achieve, or what is their status? What it means is, if you take, say, the Irish government as one example, and we would be a fairly average country in terms of enthusiasm for the goals, implementation so far. I mean, there are some countries which are ahead in terms of overt enthusiasm, others who are a bit behind. Ireland would be sort of in the middle a bit. But it means that the Irish government will take the SDGs and will reflect those SDGs in each of the policy areas for which it's responsible. So if it is, let's say, the Minister for Education, the Minister for Education is expected to reflect in policy proposals what we as a country have signed up to in the SDGs. I say reflect because, in other words, the government as a whole has to take account of the SDGs and clearly take account of them in framing its programme for government, in framing its what it's doing in each department and across departments. There is a national coordination platform almost to hold the government to account on that, to keep tabs on compliance with the SDGs, and the same is happening in every country in the world. There is also a multi-stakeholder platform. That means there's an arrangement for civil society and the private sector and others to follow what the government is doing, to advise, to challenge, to criticise, and again that is expected and is happening in most countries of the world. So this is part of the implementation machinery, and it does give an opportunity to, whether it's in relation to sport or otherwise, it gives an opportunity to hold the government to account. And there's naturally a vast agenda of commitments entered into in the SDGs. Sport would be only one, but you can imagine that there are civil society groups matching every commitment, and so we all agreed as governments that this was the right thing, that governments should be held to account. In some countries, it's the only way of holding the government to account. In a country like Ireland, you've got a working parliament, parliamentary democracy. You have ways of whereby members of parliament can ask questions of the government, etc. That's not the case in many governments, as you know, or in many countries, so that civil society will play a bigger role in holding those governments to account. But overall, really, the way I would sum it up is it's not a legally binding framework. No government will be punished if it doesn't make enough progress or if it doesn't make rapid enough progress. But there is a kind of a moral pressure that which I can explain as follows, or illustrate as follows. Peer pressure is really what it's all about. This is how we hope the goals will be achieved. Let me take as a fictional example Central America. We'll say Mexico, we'll imagine, is leading the group of Central American countries in relation to health. But perhaps Guatemala, as a smaller neighbour, is doing better on education. Mexico does not want to feel politically embarrassed by the fact that its performance in education is not as good as that of Guatemala. So Mexico has an incentive to improve its act. And that may seem like a trivial example, but that is really what we hope will be the motor for SDGs implementation, that countries tend to be sensitive to what their neighbours are doing. So it's unlikely that, let's say, Russia will be too troubled by what Chile is doing, but Russia might be more concerned with what the US is doing, or countries will have a sense of where they fit in the world, and in the case of Ireland, we probably would have an interest in what Denmark is doing or the Netherlands. So this sense of looking over one's shoulder at what the neighbours are doing, that is, we mightn't perhaps put it in those terms, but that is really what we are hoping will achieve progress, and we're seeing it in the annual UN body which monitors progress. So look, I think I'll draw those remarks to a conclusion. I hope I've given you at least food for thought, and I'm very happy to try to answer any questions that either come from the room or from those online. But in the meantime, Catherine and I will pursue some of this. Yeah.